Chapter 48, Copperhead Cabin. Ed returned to Bluestone Camp, this time as a counselor. He thought he'd died and gone to heaven. He felt like he'd been born to work at camp. He knew the woods, he knew how to lead a bunch of kids on adventures, he played the guitar, and he loved to share from his Bible around the campfire. Well, the kids liked having Ed as their counselor. He took them creek stomping and caught crawdads to boil and eat. He showed them what a sassafras bush looked like and taught them to make sassafras tea. They climbed trees and made mud slides. They built homes in the woods, complete with lazy boy recliners made of rocks. They tried to make history at Bluestone, doing things no one had ever done before. They called themselves the Lucky Dogs because they got to be in his cabin. One memorable night, as his group was gathered around the campfire for devotions, he was interrupted by anxious whispers coming from the far side of the circle. A couple of the kids were looking off into the dark woods behind them. "What's wrong?" asked Ed. "Do you hear something?" they replied. It was the wrong question to ask a bunch of city kids out in the woods on a dark night. Given half a minute, just a little imagination, those kids could hear just about anything, whether it was real or not. Ed had to respond decisively. "Don't worry," he said bravely. "I've got this. But I'm going to need a flashlight." In seconds, a heap of flashlights appeared at his feet. Choosing the two strongest beams, Ed set out through the darkness in the direction of the noise. His campers cowered close to the fire, wondering what they'd do if their counselor were killed and the creature came for them. Ed picked his way across the ravine and through a couple of fallen trees. Sure enough, there was something out there. It was moving towards him, making enough noise to wake the dead. Leaves rustled. Branches snapped. Images of large carnivores began to take shape in Ed's mind. Just as he decided it'd be smart to get out of there, he spotted motion in the beam of his flashlights. Ed froze. It moved closer, making even more noise. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? Just then, two black, beady eyes caught the light. A small nose twitched in its beam. The black and white coat revealed a baby skunk out for a midnight stroll in the woods. Ed released the breath he'd been holding and started to laugh. Who would have thought such a tiny creature could make such a racket? But there were other things that Ed didn't like. Most of his fellow counselors were not born-again Christians. They were more like the freshmen Ed had known at St. Andrews. Nice enough people, but tired of religion and lacking a passionate relationship with God. On the weekends, between camps, they would hang out in the craft lodge and drink beer. Ed was troubled for two reasons. As a teacher, he recognized that time at camp was an incredible, teachable moment, and he wondered what kids in the other groups were learning. On the other hand, having only recently experienced true love, he wanted to share it with his campers. So it was, he found himself a week before his second summer at camp, heavy-hearted and concerned. He made a bold decision. Before returning to camp, he was going up into the hills, like Jesus, to fast and pray. He wanted to be prepared spiritually for this important ministry. He was not responsible for the other counselors, but like Pastor Tommy of the little Pentecostal church where he'd been saved, Ed wanted more than to just know something about God. He wanted to hear from Him directly, to stand barefoot before a burning bush. Ed collected his Bible in a notebook. He rolled up his sleeping bag and filled a couple of milk jugs with water. He put on his boots, grabbed some matches, and let his folks know where he'd be. Then he headed out the door. As he passed the spring where the ponies got watered, he heard a noise behind him. There trotted their yellow beagle mixed dog, Glory. Her tongue lolled out the side of her doggy smile, and she looked up at Ed hopefully. "Go home," said Ed, and turned to head up the hillside. 5 minutes later, he heard something behind him trotting through the leaf litter. There was old Glory, still hopeful, still smiling. "Go home, I said," warned Ed. He picked up a stick and threw it in her direction, but she was unfazed. "Okay," conceded Ed, "but don't say I didn't warn you." He headed back up the steep hillside, quietly pleased to have the company. Ed and Glory reached the ridge line and turned north, following old fire roads in the back country. He was heading to a place he'd discovered while rambling through the mountains. It was an old hunter's cabin, built of unchinked logs. The hilltop site had been cleared of trees to make the cabin, and a thicket of thorny blackberry vines had grown up around it. The building was small, just big enough for a bunk bed of rough lumber and a spot to make a fire on the dirt floor in the corner. It had no door. After hiking for 3 miles, Ed was glad to set his water jugs down and unroll his sleeping bag on the rough boards of the bunk. He took a long drink, then pulled out his Bible. He set a goal for himself of reading through the entire New Testament before heading home. He would underline passages that might be useful in his work with campers and make notes in his notebook. Pausing to take a drink from time to time, Ed worked his way through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The stories came to life and fit together in meaningful new ways. The sun set, and Ed lit a small fire in the corner of the cabin. His stomach rumbled, so he took a long drink of water. Then he stretched out to get some sleep. Old Glory hopped on the bunk and curled up comfortably against his back. The next day he read about the apostles, filled with power from on high, witnessing to what they'd heard and seen. He continued as Paul preached his way through Asia Minor and wrote inspiring letters to the young churches. His notebook filled, his water jugs emptied. Night fell again, and Ed built another small fire in the corner. He slipped off his boots and crawled into his sleeping bag. Glory in her spot close beside him. Around 2 o'clock, Ed woke with a start. Glory was on her feet, barking furiously. Ed sat up and looked around. The cabin was pitch black, and Ed regretted not packing a flashlight. He made Glory quiet down and listened. Then he heard the sound of rustling leaves, not coming from outside the cabin, but from inside, just a couple of feet from where he lay. Now, he'd grown up in the country, so he didn't panic. It could be a mouse or a squirrel. Why, might even be a baby skunk. He reached for a boot and tossed it in the direction of the sound. Whatever it was, froze. Ed stopped to process this information. When a boot's thrown at a mammal, its instinct is to run away. Reptiles, on the other hand, will freeze. He picked up his other boot and tossed it. The thud was immediately followed by the uncomfortably familiar buzz of a rattlesnake.